It didn't happen on the court. No buzzer, no crowd, no cameras rolling. It started with a decision made behind closed doors, a decision no one was supposed to hear about until it was already too late. Because for years, one name had been untouchable. One presence had defined dominance in the WNBA, and then, without warning, that certainty cracked. There was no injury report, no official explanation that satisfied anyone watching from the outside. Just a list, a roster, and one name missing that no one expected to disappear. At the exact same time, another name wasn't just included, it was elevated. Fast, loud, impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark wasn't just stepping in. She was stepping into something much bigger. Because this wasn't just a selection. It was a signal, a shift in power. And by the time the world noticed, the game had already started moving on. For nearly a decade, one name sat at the center of everything. Aya Wilson was not just a star in the WNBA, she was the standard. MVP trophies were not milestones for her. They were expectations. Championship runs were not goals. They were routine. Every season, the league adjusted around her. Defenses collapsed for her. Game plans were built to survive her, not stop her. She was the player coaches trusted when everything broke down. The one opponents circled on scouting reports and still failed to contain when it mattered most. In the paint, she was inevitable. On defense, she was a wall. In big moments, she did not shrink, she expanded. By the time the league entered its modern spotlight era, Wilson was already established as the face of it. The player every conversation eventually returned to, and that is what made everything that came next feel impossible. Because when someone becomes that dominant, people stop asking if they can be replaced. They assume they can't be. At first, nobody treated it as a takeover. It looked like hype. It looked like attention. It looked like another young star entering the WNBA with big expectations. But then the numbers started breaking patterns. And then the arenas started filling earlier. And then the broadcasts started changing tone. And then something even bigger happened. Casual fans started watching. Caitlin Clark did not rise quietly through the system. She bent it. Deep shots from distances that should not be comfortable. Offensive reads that forced entire defenses to rotate before she even crossed half court. Moments that didn't just score, they trended. Every game became a highlight cycle. Every possession felt like it could end up everywhere. And suddenly, the league that had spent years building stability around established stars was experiencing something new, unpredictability at scale. Because this was not just a rookie impact. This was attention displacement. And in sports, attention is power. And power never stays in one place for long. At first, it was framed as growth. The WNBA had finally found a new wave of attention, new audiences, new money, new momentum. But inside that momentum, something else started forming. Not openly, not directly, but in patterns people noticed. In interviews, in timing, in tone. Aya Wilson didn't name anyone. She didn't need to. The language changed. Words like earned excellence started appearing more often. Phrases like longevity matters became repeated talking points. And every time Caitlin Clark hit another milestone, the reactions around it didn't always match the scale of the moment. To fans, it looked like celebration and tension existing in the same space. To analysts, it looked like a league adjusting in real time to a new center of gravity. Because when one player starts pulling global attention faster than the system can distribute it, comparison becomes unavoidable. And comparison is where narratives start breaking apart. Not because someone says something directly, but because silence and timing start saying enough on their own. And the more the spotlight shifted, the more every reaction started to feel heavier than the moment itself. On the surface, everything still looked like normal selection, normal planning, normal preparation inside USA basketball. But behind closed doors, the conversations were becoming more calculated, because this was no longer just about talent. It was about fit. It was about chemistry. It was about control under pressure. And every discussion carried the same unspoken question. How do you manage a team when attention itself has become a factor? Scouts were not only watching performance anymore. They were watching reactions, body language, response to pressure, how players carried themselves when things were not going their way. Because international basketball does not forgive emotional instability, it exposes it. And in those internal evaluations, patterns mattered more than reputations. What a player had done in the past was respected, but what they might become under global pressure mattered more. And slowly, quietly, the direction of those conversations started to shift toward a very different kind of roster logic, one that was less about legacy and more about who could carry the moment without breaking under it. In domestic basketball, systems are built to maximize stars. But international basketball is different. There is no comfort, no favorable rhythm, no familiar whistles. Everything is tighter, faster, more physical, and that is where the evaluation inside USA Basketball started to matter on a deeper level, because dominance in one environment does not always translate perfectly to another. Aya Wilson represents a style that thrives on structure, spacing, and rhythm. When the game flows in a familiar way, she becomes unavoidable. But when the game becomes chaotic, physical, and unpredictable, the margins change. Opponents are allowed more contact. Space disappears faster. Every possession becomes a battle, not a setup. And in that kind of environment, efficiency is not about volume or reputation. It is about repeatable creation without dependence on external factors. That is where the conversation inside the program became sharper. Because at the same time, Caitlin Clark brought something different to the table. Long-range scoring that does not rely on contact. Playmaking that creates advantage before the defense is set. Offensive impact that travels across any system. Not built on conditions, built on control. And in global basketball, that difference is not small. It is decisive. When the final roster was released by USA Basketball, the reaction was not loud at first. It was quiet, then it spread. Names were confirmed, roles were defined, futures were hinted at in silence, more than statements. And then the absence became the headline, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. For a player like Aya Wilson, whose presence had defined years of dominance in the WNBA, not seeing her name where people expected it created immediate disbelief. There was no injury narrative driving the conversation, no simple explanation that settled the noise, just a decision that reframed everything. At the same time, Caitlin Clark was there, not as speculation, not as future potential, but as part of the present structure. And that single contrast did something powerful. It didn't just update a roster, it rewired perception. Because in sports, inclusion is validation and absence forces questions that no press release can fully answer. The reaction told a story on its own. Inside the world of the WNBA, players are used to pressure. They are used to criticism. They are used to being evaluated in real time. But this moment was different. For Aya Wilson, the response carried weight. Not just disappointment, but intensity. Calls were made. Conversations followed. The situation did not stay silent for long, because when someone who has always been at the center suddenly finds themselves outside the decision loop, the emotional shock is real. Meanwhile, the other side of the moment looked completely different. Caitlin Clark did not respond through statements or signals. She responded the only way that matters in elite sport. On the floor. No escalation. No reaction cycle. No distraction from the task ahead. Just focus. And in moments like this, contrast becomes louder than explanation. One side represents urgency and frustration. The other represents composure and forward motion, and that difference, whether fair or not, becomes part of how the story is remembered. After the noise, after the reactions, after the speculation, only one thing could reset the narrative: performance. And when the games began under the structure of USA Basketball, attention immediately shifted from discussion to execution. Caitlin Clark did not ease into the moment. She absorbed it. From the opening possessions, the tempo changed, the spacing changed, the decision speed changed. Her impact was not limited to scoring. It was control, ball movement, timing, court vision, and the ability to bend defensive structure without forcing contact became the constant thread in every possession she influenced. And in that environment, numbers followed naturally. Points came when needed. Assists came when defenses collapsed. Momentum shifted when she was on the floor. For a team built under USA Basketball standards, the goal is not individual dominance. It is system stability. And in that system, her presence created flow instead of disruption. While others adapted to roles, she expanded hers without breaking structure. And that is the kind of performance that does not need interpretation. It speaks in outcomes. By the time the tournament run settled under USA Basketball, the conversation was no longer about individual moments. It was about direction, because what was unfolding was bigger than a single roster cycle or a single competition window inside the WNBA ecosystem. It was a structural shift in how the next era of basketball would be built. Caitlin Clark was no longer being discussed as potential. She was being discussed as a system point, a player around whom spacing, pace, and decision-making could be organized, not because tradition demanded it, but because outcomes started justifying it. At the same time, the league's established hierarchy was not disappearing. It was adapting. Aya Wilson still represents elite power, proven dominance, and championship experience at the highest level of the game. But the conversation around leadership is expanding beyond what has already been achieved into what can scale globally, consistently, and across different styles of competition. And that is where the timeline starts to split. One path is built on legacy, the other is built on acceleration. And both are now part of the same system moving forward. Power in sports doesn't announce itself. It shifts quietly in selections, in roles, in who gets the system built around them. Inside WNBA, the conversation is no longer just about who is dominant right now. It is about who the game naturally bends toward next. Aya Wilson remains a defining force of an era built on dominance, consistency, and physical control of the paint, a standard that shaped expectations for years. But eras do not end with decline. They end with replacement of focus. And what is emerging now is a different kind of center of gravity. Caitlin Clark represents that shift, not through declaration, but through impact that keeps pulling attention, systems, and strategy toward her style of play. The sport is not breaking. It is evolving. And evolution is never polite to hierarchy, because once the direction changes, everything built around the old structure starts adjusting to survive the new one. And in that silence between what was and what is becoming, the future is already in motion. There is no final whistle for moments like this. No official announcement that confirms a turning point in real time. Inside the WNBA, history rarely changes loudly. It changes gradually, through decisions that feel small in isolation, but massive when viewed together. A roster choice here, a rotation shift there, a different name getting a different role at a different moment. Aya Wilson still stands as one of the most dominant forces the game has ever produced. A player who defined an era through consistency, control, and championship expectation. But the game does not pause for eras. It layers them. And in that layering, a new presence continues to expand its influence across every level of the sport. Caitlin Clark is not framed as a replacement in the moment itself. She is something more subtle and more powerful than that. A signal of where attention is moving, where systems are adapting, where the next version of the game is being shaped in real time. And long after the debates fade and the arguments settle, what remains is not the noise around the transition, but the transition itself. Because in the end, power does not stay still. It moves.